I'm a great believer in free speech. I think people ought to be able to say outrageous things. But if I were going to start limiting speech, one of the things I would do is I'd give people a test before they were allowed to get up on Martin Luther King Day and talk about how wonderful he is. In particular, people who have spent most of their political lives opposing everything he stood for should not be allowed to get up there and wave the Martin Luther King. But I will tell you, I am confident that Martin Luther King would have been outraged by the preaching. He showed his outrage in a calmer manner than most of us, although forceful. But he would have been outraged at this effort by some on the left to discourage voting. He fought. He was ready to die. He led people into battle to get the right to vote. How dare people now disregard that for some ideological predilection? And he also was murdered when he was out there fighting for unions and fighting against economic inequality. And the last point, Martin Luther King broke with the National Democratic Party, particularly Lyndon Johnson, who was a great friend of civil rights. Martin Luther King, as much as he understood that Lyndon Johnson had been a great friend, broke with him and angered him, and knew he was angering him because he was a very sophisticated guy, Dr. King, by coming out against the war in Vietnam. So I will say this without any question. At a time when there are people pushing President Obama to spend even more and more in the military and get more deeply re-engaged in Iraq, re-engaged in Afghanistan, send more American combat troops into that area, Martin Luther King would have thought that was a terrible idea and would have spoken out against it. Would have spoken out against it because of its futility and because it takes resources that we could use that we desperately need here at home to improve the quality of our lives and waste them in an effort that's not going to work. And so that's my last and summary point about Dr. King. And I have to say this again to many of my friends on the left. There's a lot of demonstrating going on now. Martin Luther King was the heir to Mohandas Gandhi as the leader of mass demonstrations. And there was one thing that both of them had in common. First of all, people said, well, look, they used all this civil disobedience. Yeah, they both did. They began that at a time when the people on whose behalf they were advocating legally or physically couldn't vote. And both Gandhi and Dr. King, when voting was a possibility, switched much of their emphasis to voting. They didn't stop demonstrations altogether, certainly not Dr. King. Sadly, Gandhi was murdered older than Dr. King, but at an earlier stage in having had the right to vote. But when Martin Luther King talked about a demonstration, he had a specific purpose in mind and a strategy as to how the demonstration was going to do it. Acting out because it makes you feel better. Expressing your emotional anger and frustration because things are going bad is an indulgence that serious people cannot afford if they're trying to bring change. I would urge people, there's a great book by Taylor Branch about Martin Luther King, Parting the Waters. Read that and read about a very sophisticated political strategist and tactician who, yes, was idealistic and understood that idealism had to be the only basis on which you could invoke government, but also understood that an idealism that paid no attention to whether or not anything got accomplished only made you feel good. It didn't help anybody. Martin Luther King was a zealous pragmatist. He was an idealist who thought long and hard about how to get things done. We owe him to continue that tradition in its fullest. It means thinking about how to affect political reality. Understanding political reality and accepting it as a fact doesn't mean liking it. It is the prerequisite, if you dislike it, for changing it. Dr. King exemplified how to do that, and you do it by effectively helping working people by supporting their right to join unions that will be collective advocates for them. You do it by opposing unnecessary, unwise, damaging military adventures in the service of some notion that America has somehow the obligation to rule the world when we couldn't if we wanted to and shouldn't want to. And you understand that in a political system like ours, voting is not the answer to all of our problems. but it is the beginning of trying to get the answer. So on this day, I am delighted to see this kind of a turnout. I hope that people will follow through on all of these things. Let your elected representatives know. Shelley's, you don't have to bother Shelley's people. She knows what's right. But there are other members of the Maine congressional delegation that probably ought to hear from you about some of these things. And I hope you will let them know. Thank you very much for this wonderful breakfast.